Everybody, and welcome to the 81st meeting of the Economy Committee. Some members will be attending this morning's meeting via Starleaf, and our witnesses will be briefing us via Starleaf. The meeting will be broadcast live when open to the public, and a recording will be made available on the committee's web pages on the Assembly website. The bill briefings will be hand-sorted as per protocol, and just to remind members to mute their tablet devices when they're not speaking. So moving on then to item number 1, we have apologies, I think, just from Stephen.
Just from Stephen, Chair, yes.
So those are noted. Moving on then to item number 2, which is our draft minutes. There are a copy of the draft minutes at page 5 of your packs from the meeting held on the 17th of November. So are members content that those are an accurate reflection of the meeting?
Content.
Thank you. So moving on then to item number 3, which is Chair's business. At page 13 of our pack, there is a note from the Chairperson Liaison Group meetings of the 8th and 16th of November. Matters discussed included legislative pressures, framework for committee engagement, supporting MLAs in their roles as employers, the Interparliamentary Forum, and the induction and development framework for members. So those are for members to note. Just to highlight to members, there will be a meeting of the Interparliamentary Forum on Brexit on the 10th of December in London, and I've been invited to attend that as chair of the committee, along with the chair of the TEO committee.
Yes, Chair.
So just to seek members' agreement that I attend that on behalf of the committee.
Thank you.
And then 2 items that aren't in your pack but that members will be very aware of. There was reports over the weekend that the Hatch Regeneris report into the petroleum licensing was leaked online. I had requested through Peter that the department would therefore share that report with the committee. Obviously, there have been numerous calls for that report to be published, and considering that there are large chunks of it apparently published, it would be very useful for the committee to at least have sight of that report, but it should be published anyway publicly as part of our consideration, obviously, of the energy strategy. See no reason why they would not publish that report. Obviously, there have been the consultations on the petroleum licences that have been submitted. There's no support for petroleum development or exploration more widely on the basis of those consultations. So I think that really it's time the department got on and published the report and made proposals in respect of that. So that's something that the committee may want to take a view on. And then also related to that is the energy strategy, which I don't believe we've had any update in terms of a publication date for. And no.
The last we heard, Chair, I think was the update last week was before the end of the year. And that's what the department has responded to other stakeholders, one of whom will be with us later, Stephen Agnew from Renewable NI.
But we are due to have officials next week.
We were going to have officials next week for the bill. We're now having officials next week for the area, and we'll get to that later on in the meeting. It's now more time sensitive. We have officials now in for the 8th instead. But, Chair, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to write again, to ask for a timeline. At this stage, we're very near the end of November. There isn't much of 2021 left. One would assume that if something is going to be published, there would be a known timescale for that. And the committee would be entitled to know what that timescale is. So if members are content, Chair, we can write again.
Yeah, that I think would be useful, obviously, and this has been stated previously, but we're in the midst of an energy cost crisis, and it's really important that we see that energy strategy sooner rather than later. So members are content with that, and to perhaps request the publication of the report. Do you want to answer?
Chair, just very concerned in relation to the Hatch report and just exactly where we are in respect of that. So can we have a discussion as under any other business, or do you feel that we've covered sufficient now?
Chair,
if you want to Peter,
Sorry, Chair, the response from the department when asked was that it was still under consideration of the executive, which would decide how to act on the recommendations made in the report. That was the response when I pointed out that it had been leaked. Part of it had been leaked online, and could the committee have a copy? So, Chair, what I would suggest is that the committee writes directly to the Minister and requests that, indicating again that it has been leaked online, and that the version online, I went through it line by line, is some parts of it don't make sense. So I'm concerned about sharing that purely because I'm not convinced it's the full executive summary. So that is also a concern that that's out there and people are reading that, and it isn't. Some of the English just doesn't make sense, and that's a concern, that people are seeing something that's not accurate or publication ready. So, as I say, Chair, it would be very useful for the committee to have that.
Yeah, but the department received the report in July. So.
And I think, fairness, Chair, the longer it sits in the department, the more risks there are around that being leaked.
Or parts of it being selectively leaked.
Or selectively leaked.
So, no, as I say, we've requested it, so if we can do that, Peter, and write to the Minister. Thank you. And then obviously the other thing was the announcement of the new, or the reinstatement of COVID measures and messaging, and the discussion there has been around that, and the engagement that there's going to be with sectors and agencies and public bodies in respect of the implementation and the enforcement of those. And the committee is obviously aware of the engagement forum that was previously in place and had a lot of positive feedback from that as a forum for different perspectives to be brought together and to be aired, and for agreement on a way forward. It might be useful if that forum was to be reconstituted, and perhaps if the committee was agreed that we would write to the Minister and to the Executive Office to that effect, as a forum for that engagement to continue. If members are agreed.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on then to item number 4, which is our briefing from Rachel Woods, MLA, on her private member's bill on domestic abuse safe leave. So if we could have Rachel brought into the spotlight, please, and just to refer members to the Domestic Abuse Safe Leave Bill as introduced at page 15. There's an explanatory and financial memorandum at page 27, and then a clerk's memo on the bill at page 31. This is the committee's opportunity to discuss the bill with the proposer prior to second stage debate, which is going to take place next Monday in the Assembly. So if we hand over to Rachel to make an opening statement, and then we can bring members in for questions. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully you can hear me okay, and hopefully my Wi-Fi holds up for this. But thank you very much. And I do want to thank the committee for allowing me the opportunity to present to you today and outline and discuss the principles of the Domestic Abuse Safe Leave Bill ahead of second stage, as you've said, which is scheduled for Monday the 29th of November. So just in regard to my opening statement, I'm going to address the rationale for me introducing the bill. I'll explain then what the bill does and what it doesn't do, and why, which is important. And then finally, I'm going to set out the financial implications, and I'll be very, very happy to take any questions from members or comments or suggestions. So domestic abuse, as we know, is a workplace issue. It is not confined to the home. And a growing body of research demonstrates the impact that abuse has had on workers and businesses, and common themes that come through are mental health problems, workplace disruption, decline in productivity and performance, on-the-job harassment, reduction of time spent in the workplace, employment instability, and job loss and unemployment. Domestic abuse affects both the employees and the employer, and studies from Canada, the US and New Zealand all highlight those similar problems, such as difficulties getting into work or being late, trouble concentrating on tasks, being assaulted before work or prevented from going into work, receiving phone calls and unwanted or unsolicited visits to the workplace, and being dismissed or forced to resign are common themes. So in 2017, a survey of 450 people in New Zealand found that out of 60% of victims and survivors that were in full-time employment before they entered an abusive relationship, more than half of them actually lost their jobs during that relationship. And in terms of research that has been conducted in Northern Ireland, in 2014, a survey by ICTU included that the responses of 1,734 people in Northern Ireland found that more than 80% of respondents who had experienced domestic violence reported that it had affected their work performance due to be distracted, tired, or unwell. And roughly a third said that they were actually late for work. Nearly half said that they were forced to take time off work to deal with it. And ICTU's report also highlights what can happen in the most extreme circumstances, and members will be aware of these high-profile cases. The cases of domestic abuse victims murdered in their place of work show just how serious the consequences of domestic violence can be, and that the violence can also take place on or outside their work premises. And one such case is that of Claire Bernal, who in 2005 was murdered by her ex-boyfriend, who was also an employee at the workplace while she was at work. And another is 2014 case of Holly Gazzard, who was murdered by her abusive partner at her place of work at the hairdressers. So in Northern Ireland since March 2020, when the first lockdown was introduced, 10 women have been killed or are suspected to have been killed by a man known to them. And we all know that we have an epidemic of domestic abuse in this region, as highlighted by Women's Aid and others, and the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions imposed to deal with it have exacerbated the problem. And the PSNI recorded over 31,000 incidents of domestic abuse in the last year, and that is just the tip of the iceberg, as we know that many crimes and incidents go unreported. And the number of domestic abuse crimes recorded, which is over 19,000, the highest since records began, and nearly twice the level recorded in 2005, representing 1 in 5 of all crimes recorded last year. So the current system, the status quo of support for victims of domestic abuse in the workplace, is not sufficient from both the perspective of the victim and also for the employer. For victims of domestic abuse, the threat of losing their job or losing vital income are significant barriers that victims and survivors face when they attempt to seek help and support. Many don't have holidays, say, to take at short notice, or have any holidays left. Maybe they've already taken them throughout the year, or be forced to take unpaid leave, utilise statutory sick pay, or leave employment altogether. And others may work shifts and not be able to get cover or swap, and then become subject to disciplinary procedures. And from the perspective of employers, difficulties arise through lost output, additional costs and extra resources required to cover that. And I would draw the committee's attention to the recent Home Office report that showed the cost of domestic abuse to businesses in England and Wales only to be somewhere in the region of 14 billion annually. And applying those figures very crudely to Northern Ireland would suggest that domestic abuse costs our economy over 400 million per year. And so this is the context in which I have introduced the bill, which will coincide and complement the Department of Justice commencing provisions on the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act, which was passed by the Assembly in January. So the Safe Leave Bill will add legal protections and support measures for victims and survivors by giving them the right to paid time off work. And being in employment is actually a key pathway for people to leave an abusive relationship, and this bill will help prevent people from losing their jobs unnecessarily. And I believe this bill does have the power to save lives, and we should consider the potential in context of everything that we discuss around it. So what does this bill do? Well, this bill creates a legal right or entitlement to safe leave for workers and employees. It inserts a new Chapter 4 into Part 3 of the Employment Rights Northern Ireland Order 1996, entitled Domestic Abuse Save Leave, which requires the Department for the Economy to make regulations entitling an employee who is a victim of domestic abuse to paid leave. And the term safe leave is a growing international concept to describe paid time off work that is used to deal with issues relating to domestic abuse, and that's why it's been used in this bill. The bill, as the EFM says, has a single policy objective, and that's to introduce a statutory provision requiring the department to make regulations specifying at least 10 days paid leave for workers and employees that are victims or survivors of domestic abuse. The new legal entitlement is envisaged as a day one right. In other words, it will not require a probationary period before entitlement is granted, and this is essential to reflect the fact that a victim and survivor does not decide or choose or how and when abuse happens, and they may require support at any time. It may be a matter of life and death, and this bill also provides a non-exhaustive list of what safe leave can be used for, which includes finding alternative accommodation, seeking healthcare and mental health care, obtaining social security support, protecting family members, and getting legal advice and attending court. But as I say, this is not an exhaustive list and can be expanded on. The minimum allowance of 10 days can also be extended, but the bill reflects the international standard and what has been implemented in other jurisdictions such as New Zealand. So I would stress to the committee, 10 days per year is the statutory minimum, and employers can go beyond that if they wish. The regulations will require approval of the Assembly, and the bill also requires the Department to provide guidance about safe leave and to report on and monitor the effectiveness of the regulations. So what the bill doesn't do, it is not prescriptive about the process and procedures that employees and employers will have to follow when it comes to safe leave. And this is important because the picture will look very different depending on the sector and the size of the employer. But the bill does allow the department, when they bring forward the regulations, the ability to develop further detail around how the leave is taken, including any reasonable conditions such as giving notice if required. The bill provides considerable scope to make supplementary provision around notices, records and procedural requirements into the regulations. However, it would be not appropriate to specify in the bill what those requirements should be on primary legislation. That detail belongs in the regulation and in secondary legislation. The bill does not place any requirement on the worker or employee to provide evidence or proof of domestic abuse, and this is crucial, not only as doing so would fuel a culture of disbelief that we as a society must face when it comes to victims, but also having a requirement of certain evidence from victims and survivors would add another barrier in accessing the leave, and this came through strongly in the consultation process. It's not a requirement for employers that already have this kind of leave in place in governments such as South Ayrshire Council or Neath Port Talbot Council in Wales, or indeed with the private sector companies in Northern Ireland that offer this kind of leave already. So the bill is deliberately drafted to be simple, clear, and to give the department an appropriate degree of flexibility to develop the regulations. And this is important so we can ensure that we can introduce this kind of leave as soon as possible. And what about costs? We cannot detach costs of safe leave from the benefits. We need to take both into consideration, just the same way I spoke about costs to business and the social and human costs to victims survivors at the beginning of my remarks. These are all interlinked, and it will be the employer's responsibility to provide safe leave, but my view, which is based on the evidence and research into this area, is that any costs associated with it will be offset by benefits. We know that victims and survivors are desperately trying to manage their circumstances at the moment, and without this support through absence, statutory sick pay, unpaid leave and so on, we know that the lack of the support, the status quo, is costing businesses a huge amount in lost output and reduced productivity. So whilst there will be a cost to employer of providing safe leave, there will also be a benefit of the business of supporting that worker and employee. And in 2016, research by Australia Institute Centre for Future Work suggested that only about 1.5% of female employees and around 0.3% of male employees are likely to utilise paid domestic leave provisions in any given year. And that same study noted, and I'm quoting directly here, the costs to employers associated with these payouts are likely to be largely or completely offset by benefits to employers associated with the provisions of paid domestic violence leave, including reduced turnover and improved productivity. It is important to mention here that roughly 1.2 million workers in Australia have access to safe leave through their employer. So the private sector has led the way in that jurisdiction, and there are now movements in the Australian Parliament to put that on a statutory footing. So the Department for the Economy have estimated some minor recurring costs, as outlined in the EFM, arising from the requirement to monitor and report on the operation of the regulations. And I would certainly welcome further discussion with officials to explore whether or not those costs could be absorbed within existing administrative infrastructure. So thank you very much, Chair. And I said I'm happy to take some comments, questions or suggestions from members at this stage.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for that overview. And you may be aware that the committee was previously on record in the debate on the domestic abuse bill when it would pass through the Assembly of being supportive of domestic abuse safe leave. So this is something obviously the committee will take a view on in respect of the bill itself, and hopefully we can do that in time for next week's debate. And obviously if it passes, which I very much expect that it will, then obviously we will be scrutinising it in detail at committee stage. I think it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, that it's hugely depressing that this bill is required. But you know, it is an actuality that many people obviously face in their lives, and I accept completely the point around the cost of the bill being offset by the benefits of it. There are figures that show that intimate partner violence against women costs the EU member states 109 billion a year, so that's huge. And anything that we can do to support people who are facing abuse, we absolutely should do. I don't have a huge amount of questions for you, Rachel, just in relation to the 10 days leave, or a minimum of 10 days leave in each leave year. I assume that would be non-consecutive.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, and totally support your comments there about why we shouldn't need to have this leave, but it's an unfortunate situation that we do. But I think that this kind of leave certainly will add another layer of support for victims and survivors. But in terms of the 10 days is an annual requirement in this bill, and it cannot be rolled over or accrued. So you wouldn't need to take it all at once. It would be as and when you require it as a victim or survivor.
I think that absolutely makes sense. You might be aware also that in the development or the scrutiny of the parental bereavement leave bill, the committee made an amendment to it to make it a day one right. So that's something that I think we would continue to support in the scope of this bill as well. Obviously, it's something that an employee or a worker should be able to access from their first day of employment. And just in relation to the definition of employee or worker, is that something that you have scoped out so that it is applicable to workers as well as employees?
Yes, Chair, we have. The only thing that we haven't been able to nail down, and I hope that the committee could look at that should this pass second stage, is the extension of this right to those who are self-employed. But Article 112 ED, which is in the bill, extends the provisions to workers as well as employees, and this means that in practice even those without a formal written chapter or contract would still be able to take the safe leave. And employment status is complicated, and I do not pretend to know all of the ins and outs of employment law, but I do understand that there is a basic distinction between employees and workers, which is why they've both been referenced in this bill. So it's trying to capture everybody that we can. Now there's some mutuality of obligations factor, which is particularly complex. For example, some people have asked me whether the bill would cover workers on 0-hour contracts. Now obviously hoping we're to ban 0-hour contracts through another private member's legislation, but unfortunately I wouldn't be able to give a clear answer on that, but it will depend on the nature of the contract. but I also, again, wouldn't be qualified on viewing a contract to make a call, and that's where we still have those advice lines and support, such as the Law Centre and Labour Relations Agency would obviously then have a role in this. But I would certainly be fully supportive of any measures that the committee or the department could utilise to bring this in for self-employed, but that's why we've made the distinction between workers and employees on the face of this bill.
Thank you for that. And obviously, once it would pass to committee stage, then those are points of scrutiny that we can pick up with officials directly, and we'll be happy to do that to support it through. And so I'm going to bring in other members for questions. First up's Mike.
Chair, thank you, and Rachel, thanks for the briefing. Supportive. Just a couple of relatively small points, I think, if I may. Tell us about the consultation process.
Thank you, Mike. The consultation process we ran for 8 weeks last year. And it was an online survey, and we got just on the dot 450 responses, which was quite surprising, and it was great to see. And a number of them were written submissions, but the majority was on a survey, and we asked quite a number of questions, all anonymous, so people could feel open to giving their personal experiences, which was very eye-opening. I'm more than happy to give the committee some more information on the breakdown if that's the kind of information that you would want. But I would, and just in terms of one aspect of it, on the evidence and proof example in the consultation in the bill, we asked if they thought a victim or survivor of abuse should have to prove evidence or give evidence or proof to their employer, and only 32% of people responding felt that this was appropriate. And they raised a number of issues about communication and also about workplace policies. So we had a lot of respondents talking about what they wanted to see in the bill, but 98% of the 450 respondees were supportive of making this into legislation.
Okay. The other point, Rachel, was you gave us a list of things that people could do while they're taking this paid leave, one of which was seeking social security support. How would that work? What would that be for?
Thanks, Mike. I'm thinking here in terms of, say, for example, you maybe had to leave your home, and maybe you were going into, say, private rented sector, or if you were being in temporary accommodation, you may need to deal with the housing executive. You may need to apply for personal independence payment as well. And as we know that is a very lengthy and difficult process, you may need to seek advice on social security, but we're not trying to be prescriptive of exactly what people can and can't take this leave for. Domestic abuse is a very personal thing, and people will need different support. So I'm more than welcome for any views from the committee or suggestions of whether or not things need to be added in or clarified on that. But we're making the point that this is a very non-exhaustive list, and it's not just to be used for those sort of things that we've put in the EFM.
Okay, that's useful. Thanks, Rachel. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mike. Can we bring Peter into the spotlight, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Rachel, thank you for the presentation, and obviously a very important subject in terms of the domestic abuse. I suppose just to probe a couple of questions on it. Rachel, it'd be useful, and then maybe this may be less a question of you answering directly, maybe getting us the information. You'd obviously mentioned about where there have been a number of worked examples where this is applied in other jurisdictions on that regard. I think if there are any statistics in the worked examples of what the uptake of this has been in different jurisdictions, I think that would be helpful. Obviously, that's something where you maybe provide us the information on, just respond directly in relation to it. Rachel, you mentioned on the cost side of it, I suppose two aspects, and maybe to be fair, maybe provide this, I haven't seen it directly, figures. You mentioned, first of all, the department had indicated there would be a small level of cost that would be sort of, call it either the setting up or directly the department. Do you have the figures in terms of what the cost of that would be? And secondly, in relation to cost element, I appreciate the point that you've made, which is that for employers, the potential in this will be that it will be at least sort of self-washing, if you like, in terms of the cost element of it, the whatever the saving is. But you've given us sort of an estimate of where you see the overall cost, the cost of domestic abuse to employers each year annually. In terms of, from the point of view of the cost to employers of your bill, and obviously you're saying that is a much lesser figure, do you have any level of estimates of what the direct cost would be to employers, leaving aside the fact that that may well be something which is, if you like, overtaken by the savings?
Thank you, Peter. I'm certainly happy to provide the committee with further information on uptake in different jurisdictions this past second stage.
Hello?
I think Rachel has froze there.
Yep.
Oh, maybe back.
We've lost system.
Knocked her camera off. Rachel, can you hear us? Can we bring Rachel back into the spotlight?
She's
She's still there?
she's reappeared, Tom, down at the bottom. If you want to bring her back up, hopefully that'll. There we go. There we go.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know what happened there. Apologies, Peter, mid-flow. So in terms of the uptake in different jurisdictions, yes, I'm more than happy to provide the committee that. That's not a problem at all. Should the bill pass second stage. In terms of the cost, department, the exact, yes, it's in the explanatory notes there, but the department figures on producing a report and reporting on the operation of the Act is between 7,200 and 76,000 annually. And that is the reporting, producing a report on the operation of the Act for the 7,200 per annum, and the cost of establishing a section to monitor on compliance would be 76,000 per annum. But I would welcome further discussions with the department, as I say, on that to see if those kind of costs could be absorbed within existing administrative infrastructure and anything that the department are reporting on already. There will be costs, as you say, to employers and to business. And as I said, this will vary considerably depending on the size, the staff numbers and the sector, but we have to consider this alongside the benefits. It cannot be looked in isolation. So it will, as I say, depend on staff size and uptake of the leave, but it is very difficult to quantify direct costs because there are already costs there. So in terms of, it can't be drawn directly from estimates or prevalence from domestic abuse across society, because not all victims are going to take this leave. And that's what we have seen in other jurisdictions such as Australia and such as in New Zealand. The prevalence is very high, but the level of people and the number of people taking it is quite low. So we kind of have to look at this in terms of uptake, which we know will not be, they're not going to be 100% of employees in the civil service, let's say, taking this leave. That's not going to happen. But based on evidence elsewhere, it's something that only employees who really need it do take it. So I gave the Australian example earlier on. It was only 1.5% of female employees and 0.3% of male employees in 2016, and that was out of a study of 1.5 million people who had access to the leave. So the councils that we had been speaking to, which have this in operation in Wales and in Scotland, when discussing a policy for approval, they actually anticipated no additional cost to the council for introducing this leave, as it would just be managed from other budgets and other types of leave. So in my view, the costs to employers associated with paid leave and introducing this are likely to be completely offset by the benefits, including less sick absence and improved productivity, less reliance on agency workers, and so on. And the costs, as we know, of domestic abuse to the economy and society are significant, and even a single incident or a single reduction in prevalence or incidents resulting from statutory provision, I think would outweigh any direct and immediate costs to employers. But as I say, it is very difficult to quantify. But we have seen from experience in the countries and the jurisdictions that have this in already that there has been no additional costs to employers.
Okay, the other point just I wanted to probe, Rachel, and I appreciate in terms of the broad format, which I think is a broadly sensible approach of establishing a range of principles, but also then by nature that some of the detail will be, quite often, I suppose, particularly with either, be it either sort of departmental or private members' bills, will be to essentially put a marker down that to some extent there's a certain level of paving legislation that some of the detail will then be put forward in regulations, and that is not that unusual. Either from the example of where, for example, you mentioned in terms of the council side of it, or where it's been in place, I appreciate the good arguments that are there in terms of a qualifying mechanism for this, that there are downsides and problems of having to provide some level of proof in relation to it. Is there, in terms of any of the sort of worked examples where it has been, do any of those bodies, organisations, etc., have any qualifying bit on it? Because I suppose to play the devil's advocate in relation to this, it's important that level of support is given to those who are suffering domestic abuse. But I suppose there would be a slight worry, will there be individuals within the system who will, as is the case, I suppose, in many aspects of life, will there be individuals who simply, if it's simply a question of saying, I want this leave, whatever, may abuse the system, and simply try and take advantage of, here's a provision, if there's absolutely nothing at all to actually qualify for the thing on that basis on it. And I suppose from some level of mechanism, at least, to be able to say, here's the thing to actually qualify for this entitlement in that regard. I just wonder, in terms of what has happened elsewhere, are there any examples where there is at least even some level of qualification is there, even if it's not a particular level of proof? Or, how would you, I suppose, stop somebody, an individual, simply trying to take advantage of this and abuse the system, as unfortunately we see sometimes in different points of employment law, where there'll be a few people will always try to exploit any situation, and I think the danger in that will be that it will create other problems for those who are the vast majority who are genuine victims.
Thank you, Peter. No, this is something that we have discussed with certainly the two councils that we have in the UK that have introduced this, and it's I suppose without saying, it's a very simple tick box exercise, and there's a big amount of discretion that line managers and HR have in terms of an employee coming to them asking for leave. So we haven't put it on the face of the bill, as you've noted. That is not something that we put in primary legislation. That comes in regulations, and it is important that the regulations are clear for employers and employees. So, as you say, the level of detail wouldn't be appropriate to be prescriptive of exactly how it works for each business, because it will work differently. It will work differently from the SME with 10 employees to a business that's got 2, and then say for the likes of the civil service. So the regulations that we have on the face of the bill, though, may require the employee to give notice. Now, that's if appropriate. Or applicable, because obviously a victim of domestic abuse doesn't choose when this happens or if it happens. So it could be the morning before work, could be the night before. Therefore, the morning of work, you're not going to be able to give a week's notice to take that kind of leave. So, but we have those sort of flexibilities in there, and it's a reasonable request and respects the right of employers. So the minimum standard does need to be set. We have seen in the likes of Danske Bank, who have this in here, that there's no requirement of proof or evidence. The same in New Zealand. There is no requirement of proof or evidence to be given. And certainly that is something that came through very strongly in the consultation, the culture of disbelief that requiring certain levels of evidence and proof for victims to give to a manager or an HR department would actually put them off of getting it. We have absolutely no evidence of anybody abusing this system since it's been introduced in other jurisdictions. There is not one piece of discussion or evidence on that. We had discussed just sort of between, in a team and with other people, could this be a simple form that one puts in, like a self-cert form? That we do for SSP. So those are the sort of things that I would be encouraging the department to look at, and in consultation with victims and survivors, and also with employers, with the Labour Relations Agency. But anybody abusing any form of leave, obviously this is subject to any other leave is, and falls under the employment law. So it would be still subject to tribunal and anything like that. All of those processes are still in place there, but we have absolutely no evidence of any of this being abused since it's been introduced elsewhere.
Okay, I suppose just the final point, which I'm sure, I suppose the balance to be struck as well in this is that from the point of view of how prescriptive the legislation is, there is a need, I suppose, to tease out some of the details, which will be where regulations will come into play. I suppose the balance in that is the sooner that, both from an employee point of view, who would be potentially victims of domestic abuse, and also from the employer point of view, I suppose the more certainty that we can give both sides of that at the soonest possible opportunity, the better, because I think both employees and employers like that level of certainty, and that, I suppose that's more of a comment really rather than a question. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Peter. Matthew?
Thank you. I suppose it's just worth saying, I don't know, Rachel, if you're willing to confirm. I mean, my understanding is that, if, for example, I wanted to claim paternity, even just paternity leave as opposed to shared parental leave, I wouldn't need to prove that I wouldn't need to, bring in demonstrable proof that my partner was expecting a child, and this was just sort of scans or forms at the hospital. There is a kind of a degree of not necessarily self-regulation, but as you say, there are other thresholds, indeed, kind of social thresholds around the expectations around the likelihood of someone fabricating information to their employer, such as they are about to have a child or they are subject to domestic abuse. I suppose my question is kind of sort of connected. I suppose, is it in your consultation, part of how this works will always be the level of information to employees, but also information for employers. If you're if you're Danske Bank, if you're Sainsbury's, the civil service, and you've got a big HR function, information will be internalised. What are your thoughts on how this information is? I mean, clearly supportive of the principles of this bill, but if it became law, what would be your thought on best practice in terms of socialising, if you like, or spreading the information out among particularly small employers, and then connected to employees?
Thank you, Matthew. So do you mean in terms of how I would perceive like an awareness raising campaign, exactly, and things like that?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that would absolutely, without a doubt. We know just and I've obviously worked on the domestic abuse legislation at length, and the stalking bill and so on, and all these the new offences, and there will have to be public information. The department within this bill, however, there is a requirement on the department to publish guidance, and that would be for every employer, every business of all size, and obviously engagement with the unions, which I have been doing throughout this. There were already discussions going on. I know that the civil service have just introduced new policies. These are the sort of things that would have to go out, and that's where the guidance comes in as well. But I would be absolutely open and very, very supportive of public information campaigns, and that's for both workers and employees and employers, and on their rights. But it would certainly be something I would definitely support.
Great. Okay. And just on the you mentioned the Australian example, the relatively small take up. I suppose is the information rich enough to suggest that, or detailed enough to suggest that is because, in a sense, the provision is working because this is a relatively, this will apply to well, obviously not small enough given we know there is an epidemic of abuse happening, but that this will just inevitably be something that's taken up by a tiny number of actual employees, or is there a factor around lack of awareness? I don't know if the information you have kind of answers that question.
Thanks, Matthew. Actually, if I point to Italy actually has up to 3 months for an employee to take off for basically anything that they require, and actually the take up in Italy is extremely low because there is lack of awareness of the leave. So they have it in there, but they don't call it safe leave. But and it's in comparison, this looks extremely generous, but it can be taken for a variety of things. The awareness that people were aware of it, but it. I don't have the level of detail in terms of the if it's low because of awareness or because of that. I'm more than happy to go back and look at that research just to see if that is in there, but I don't have that information on it. We have seen in New Zealand uptake has been, it's not, again, as I say, it's not every employee then suddenly rushing to take time off. People are aware of it. It was a huge public awareness campaign that went on in New Zealand, and it was certainly something that took a long time to get through. But I think the lack of data is a problem, and that's something that I would certainly be willing to work with the committee to ensure that we do, which is why I have the reporting requirement on that, on the effectiveness and the uptake, if possible. I appreciate that sometimes reporting on uptake, especially if numbers are so low, we might not need or might not want to get down a line that we actually then are able to identify people. So I appreciate that there's a lot of information GDPR issues there. Yeah. That's why we put the reporting requirement on this bill. It's not something that we have seen implemented elsewhere. In terms of the example of Italy, uptake is low because awareness is low.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Rachel.
Matthew. Stuart.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Rachel, for your presentation. And just to confirm, we met the other day, but very supportive of this bill and its objectives, indeed. But just a number of questions around it. And you have clearly explained the bill sets out the principles of domestic abuse safe leave. What it doesn't do is be prescriptive in terms of how that's actually interpreted on the ground by employers. And I think that's the right approach that you've taken in respect of this. Certainly from my perspective, having worked 30 odd years in the Labour Relations Agency, I think that coming at a bill from this direction is the right way. But it will mean, on the assumption that the bill passes, that it will then move to the next step, which will be presumably in the next mandate, where the department will have to implement the bill. That will be done by regulation and codes of practice around all of this. Now, in some of the conversation you've had with members this morning has been about what may be described as large employers and employers who are in the public sector. I have an area of concern, and it goes back over many, many years, about lots of employment law, which is by and large well implemented right across the UK by the types of employers we've been talking about. But the difficult areas are the small employers, the employers who are want to get, there are many of whom want to get things right, but equally well there are many employers for whom employment law is a nuisance and something which they have very little interest in, and in fact they try to avoid on as many occasions as they can. And it's around that area that I want to tease out a little more information about from all of this. We've just been through the parental bereavement leave bill, and while there are areas of confidentiality around that, for example, we're hoping to include a right around miscarriage, and some people will not be very comfortable if they know that lots of people are aware of their personal circumstances. But in this case, to be aware of the personal circumstances of somebody who is in an abusive relationship or abusive circumstances isn't just the embarrassment or the personal upset of their circumstances being known about, they are potentially life-threatening. Therefore, going forward, I would hope that some reference will be made to a higher standard of confidentiality and indeed penalties being required with regards to breach of confidentiality. You do not want water cooler conversations about did you know about so-and-so and why they are off. Just like to hear your reaction to some of that.
Thank you, Stuart. No, I appreciate that. Absolutely. I think this also just draws into a wider conversation that everybody needs to have about, appropriate conversations and what is not appropriate in the workplace too. But in terms of your discussion on confidentiality, so confidentiality is extremely important, and the department, when developing the regulations, I would very, very much happy to encourage them, but also if the committee would like to look at having something on the face of the bill, as I'm absolutely no issue with that whatsoever, to explore this further. But in terms of the bill's current provisions, so under new Article 112EE, entitled its Chapter 4 Supplemental, on page 3, it states that the regulations may make provisions about procedures, make provisions requiring employers to keep records, and make provision for the consequences of failure to give notices, to keep records, or to comply with other procedural requirements. Now, in my view, the bill does give the department considerable scope to ensure that regulations would include a provision for the keeping of all employee records and confidential, and to set out minimum standards or procedural requirements. But if the committee would like to see something stated on the face of the bill, specifically in the wording to reflect sort of confidentiality, and to try and encompass that or incorporate the water cooler conversations, if you said, I'm more than happy to look at it. But just in terms of the research that we've done and what we've looked at in other jurisdictions, other councils, other companies, I have not come across, nor I am aware of, any example of breaches of confidentiality or leaked personal information where safe leave has been introduced. I fully appreciate the differences between, say, a large business with an HR department and different line managers and so on, to, say, a cafe or somewhere down the road that you're going into, or a small corner shop. I absolutely appreciate that. I think we do have a bigger job of work to do to encourage and ensure that all businesses of any size have got, say, domestic abuse workplace policies, that they're understanding of domestic abuse and how it affects the workplace. I think that's a bigger job of work to do, and certainly one that we discussed in committee when we were looking at the domestic abuse bill. And I know that the economy minister was to bring forward changes in sort of employment relations, employee relations, and so on, and industrial relations. And I assume that will be the next mandate. But these are all interlinked. But certainly, to answer your question in terms of confidentiality, I'm very much open to having that on the face of the bill, should the committee feel that it's not covered in the supplemental. But also, we did look at this, trying to make sure that or trying to see if we could put workplace policies within primary legislation. We can't, but we certainly would encourage every business, every employer, and every employee to make themselves familiar with domestic abuse and how it does affect staff.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Stuart. Can we bring Claire into the spotlight, please?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Rachel. You'll not be surprised to know that you have my full support in terms of what you're trying to do, and just want to applaud you for the work that you're doing, because I think this is another step, not only in terms of protecting victims of domestic abuse, but also sending that message out there that this is one of the most prevalent things within our society, and we need to be looking at it from all aspects, not just within the home, but how it impacts throughout our lives, including the workplace. I suppose some of my comments maybe questions, or maybe following on from what other members have said in and around this space. It's really to kind of come back to the comments around I suppose a form of certification, and it's not necessarily from my perspective to prove that this is happening, but really to keep a paper trail that might in itself protect the employee as well as the employer. I'm thinking of it in terms of other similar legislation, and I didn't know Stuart worked for the Labour Relations Agency, so that's very useful to know. He might be able to advise in this way. But for example, if someone works in a workplace for less than a year, their rights, I suppose, if you like, are limited up to to that 1 year mark, except in the case of, I think, flexible working. So say an employee asks for flexible working, they're denied that, and then before that year is up, they may be potentially their contract terminated or whatever else. But that flexible working bit can then, I suppose, equip them to take an unfair dismissal or kind of tribunal at that point. I suppose I'm concerned that if there's no paper trail in relation to asking for that, and in this case, if someone did ask for that leave, and there's no paper trail there, could this then not be used as a potential unfair dismissal type thing? So I suppose what I'm trying to understand it from employment law and ensuring that the employee is protected and that there is a paper trail insofar as protecting them against bad employer practices. And I think even from an employer's perspective too as well, because there is because this is limited to 10 days. There will need to be some sort of record, I suppose, to ensure that that they're giving the right type of leave. And I'm also conscious as well, and you talked about it earlier too, that this will also go hand in hand with other type absences within the workplace. So the domestic abuse can cause sickness related absences. So at what point is it sick leave, and at what point is it safe leave, if you know what I mean? And then I suppose then that gets muddled in terms of statutory leave and contractual leave, and so I suppose I'm just trying to think through all the the different things, even as an employer myself, and how we can ensure that we're doing this right and that it won't give rise to any sort of complications if things get complicated. The other question I was going to ask as well is practically what does this look like on the ground? And maybe you've already answered that insofar as it will be up to each workplace to develop their own workplace policy around this, or even in terms of regulations. Will it be a matter of an employee saying, look, I just need safe leave, or will they have to somehow explain what that means? Even verbally, if not in the form of a written type of self-certification. I think you've already mentioned this too. There's no qualifying period, so the person doesn't have to be in employment for like 6 months to a year for this, to be eligible for this type of leave. The other one is data. I think what could be useful to the wider piece around domestic abuse and the prevalence of it in Northern Ireland would be the data in terms of how many people are actually requesting this type of leave, and how many are not requesting it, because as we know, not reporting is as much a piece to the picture as anything else. And my last question is there anything that came out of the consultation that you haven't put forward to the bill because you maybe feel that it wouldn't get support, but it is something that we could potentially be working towards? So thank you.
Thanks, Claire, for your comments there. I'll go in reverse order in terms of what came out in consultation and what we haven't looked at. I mentioned it there, but it was about making sure that flexible working was in. We can't do that on this bill, and also couldn't legislate on primary legislation to ensure that every business or employer has a workplace policy. That's policy rather than legislation. So those were two aspects that certainly came through from the consultation responses. But I mean, if the committee can look at this, I have no issue with that whatsoever. But we were trying to put forward a bill that we felt was balanced with the Article 1 rights, and so from employer to employee, and something that we can progress. Another thing that came through is actually a lot of the people in the consultation, and I can't remember the percentage just off the top of my head, but actually wanted more than 10 days, and thought that it would be much better for with more. But that's why we have actually put it into the bill that is a minimum of 10 days rather than that is the maximum. So it is at a minimum, the department must produce regulations for a minimum of 10. So if you have an example, one that was given to me during the week there, well, what if somebody's taken 10 days and needs one more? Well, that would be the employer's discretion, and certainly if the employer was taking that and going, yes, you'll have another day, but that would be the discretion. It's not to say that the department or the employers, it's 10 days only. It's a statutory minimum.
Yeah, Rachel, that's not pro rata at all in terms of working hours or anything like that, or maybe that's no. Okay.
No. So in terms of the reporting and monitoring, that's why we put in for the department has a role then to report and monitor on the take up of this leave, and that would then necessitate data collection. And certainly you'll be aware, I've been talking about this for the guts of a year now on domestic abuse, and also all sort of, reporting about how important data collection is and reporting, because if we don't know what we're dealing with, how are we appropriately responding to it? So I completely agree with your comments there, and that's why it's on the face of the bill there, and the department must report on this. And also monitor. That's where the costs have come from the department and the EF for those two things. In terms of what it looked like on the ground, we haven't been specific. Because again, it will differ. It will differ from your corner shop to your civil service. That will be different. From what, just from one example, one of the councils that we had been speaking to about how this works with them is that an employee or worker will give notice to or speak to their line manager. Now, there's a lot of discretion in that council because they have a very robust workplace policy on domestic abuse. A lot of training has been done with line managers. And just to give an example, during the pandemic, a member of staff understandably did not feel safe at home, because home is not always a safe place, and we know with domestic abuse that a lot happens in the home. So actually, what they were able to do was implement a policy that member of staff worked in the council offices. So it was yes, it was during pandemic, but for them to be safe in the workplace, it meant them being in the workplace. There was a lot of discretion. Now, there's no records of kept of, this person said this and this person said this. They have a very sort of, again, discretion in the line managers in the HR department, and it was taken as safe leave, domestic abuse leave, but actually recorded differently, because we have to remember that a lot of perpetrators will also be controlling victims of abuse financially and economically, and maybe they're looking at pay slips. And maybe we don't want to see domestic abuse safe leave written there. So this is the kind of flexibility that this bill, by not being prescriptive on the face of it, allows. And that's certainly something I would actively encourage the department and yourselves as well to look at. We don't have to have this written down on pay slips as safe leave. You could just have it leave. Or not, whatever way it can be recorded. But again, under Chapter 4, in terms of answering your question about a paper trail, there must be records.
Yeah.
And this is subject to the usual and the standard employment processes about leave and the employers that we have to do now. You and I all, we all know as employers, as MLAs, we have to keep records. Those are the kind of things we have to keep them confidential and secure. And if there's any issues there, they're subject to contractual agreements. And also then, and Mr. Dixon, I'm sure, will be able to give me much more information on that. That was news to me about his background, so it's very useful to have about how that works and the processes by which then employees and workers can go and seek advice. But all of that still stands, because this bill is inserting new provisions in the employment order rather than being a standalone bill. So it's already subject to all of those processes. And I hope that answers your questions.
Yes, I kind of want to come back to the flexible working, but why was that not able to be put into the bill? Just in terms of what I was talking about, that if, I wouldn't want this to be used against someone to get rid of them, after a year, because maybe they've taken quite a lot of time off, and then the employer's thinking, look, this is just not working out, and then they give another reason potentially as to that's the case, but then that individual will say, well, actually, I asked for this form of flexible working, or I asked for this this to happen, and I feel like I've now been victimised, or whatever else in relation to my ongoing employment.
So it just that would, because this is amending the employment order, that those tribunals, all of those complaints processes and that kind of thing. In terms of the sort of kind of about flexible working, that's sort of umbrella employment legislation. I don't think, and I get you, Clara will get you some more information on this, but I don't think through the scope of this bill that we can introduce flexible working just for this, rather than amending the entire employment order to introduce flexible working. Flexible working is obviously an umbrella right. for all employees and to access after certain times. So I don't think I'm just been quite a while since we looked at this now, but I don't think that we could have done it through just for this specific issue without addressing the whole industrial relations or employment relations matter about flexible working. But I will come back to you on that.
Okay, no, that's really helpful, Rachel. I'm not even entirely sure if it is prescriptive in terms of what flexible working is, and whether it includes other types of arrangements, or even specifically this one, or it's it's wide enough or general enough to do it anyway. So no, look, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Rachel, I don't have any other. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I apologise, I didn't
you're
indicate,
fine.
sir. Thanks, Rachel, so far for your answers. Members, to be fair, I've covered a lot, and you've covered a lot in your responses. I just have one question with the definition of a victim. And I think it's on page 1 of the bill, under line 10 approximately. Maybe you can, suppose, educate me on that fact. How far does that definition go? Because in a dwelling, you could have 5 victims, indirect or direct victims. So what's your interpretation from this bill for the definition of a victim? Because your mother or your father could be the victim technically, but the son or daughter living in the same house could be the victim. So how far does that go in this bill?
So in this bill, the victim survivor is the employee or worker. But I certainly to determine the eligibility for safe leave, the bill defines a victim of domestic abuse as someone who is subjected to abusive behaviour as described in the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act 2021, which has the definition within there and what amounts to domestic abuse. So in terms of this safe leave, this is a protective measure for employees and workers. Now, within what can this be used for? There's victims of domestic abuse. You've got children involved. That is also covered in the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act. So you could use your 10 days. So for child contact orders and so on for going to court, that's covered in that. So it's basically whatever the employee and a worker requires this leave for in relation to domestic abuse, but it's not related to the domestic abuse offence as defined by the Act, because that must consist of abusive behaviour on 2 or more occasions. So it's, as I say, it's a protective measure. It might be after a single incident. I need to get out of here, my life's at risk, or something has happened to my child, or something has happened, I need to go to court, or I need to go and speak to Women's Aid or Men's Advisory Project or something along those lines. But it's not for this bill to determine what kind of incidents fall under the ambit of what can be described as abusive behaviour, and that's set out elsewhere in the recently passed Domestic Abuse Act.
Yeah, but just to follow on to that, if I may, Chair. So if a lady or gentleman was the direct victim, we'll call it, we'll use that terminology, Rachel, the direct victim of the domestic abuse, you could still have children in that house who are still workers, obviously. But obviously this bill is more angled towards the direct victim, not the indirect victim. They're still all victims.
They are, yes. No, this is the purposes of this bill is to cover leave entitlement for the employee or the worker.
Which would be technically the direct victim.
In that, yeah, as long as they're the employee or the worker. So say, for example, you've got domestic abuse that's gone on in a household and you have a 17-year-old that is also working there, that they're still counted as a child. They can obviously then avail of this leave as well, but it is the employee or the worker that this is covering, rather than that you wouldn't have a situation where the children are availing of this leave unless they were employee or a worker.
Well, if they're not, let's say they're not children and they're age 20 or 21, could they still avail of this? And they're still in the workforce. So their mother has been abused. The mother's the direct victim. Can the children, they're not children, they're 21, they're 22, they're young adults, we'll call them. Can they avail of this bill?
Yes.
Okay. So you could call that a direct victim, or call it an indirect victim. If you want to use that terminology, it's probably maybe the wrong terminology, but we'll use that. So a direct victim or indirect victim of domestic abuse living in the same dwelling can avail of this bill. As long as they're employed. It's
not prescriptive about where one lives. It's about a victim of domestic abuse who is subjected to abusive behaviour as described in the Domestic Abuse Act, and that does cover wide range of relationships and breakdowns there. So if a 21-year-old living in the same house as their, say, parents or older siblings who was abusing another sibling or their mother or father or both, that would be covered should they need to go and get healthcare, mental health care for any of the other issues that we've covered, and why this safe leave would be needed to take in as an employee or a worker.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you, Rachel. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Keith. And I think that that's an interesting point that you've just made, that I think we might want to explore a wee bit more with officials, and just understanding that definition and how it applies to people, and accepting that, obviously, what Rachel you have said yourself in respect of that too. But I think maybe is there scope for that potentially to be made a bit more explicit?
Chair, I'm more than happy should this bill to be passed second stage to explore anything that the committee would feel it needs to be made explicit on the face of the bill.
No, that's really useful. Rachel, thanks for the briefing. It has been really informative, and as you have, I'm sure, noticed, there is a very broad support here from the committee in respect of the aims of the bill, and I will hopefully be making a contribution on behalf of the committee on Monday to the debate at second stage, just reflecting the discussion we've had this morning, as well as obviously members will be speaking on their own behalf as well.
Thank you, Chair, and just once again, thank you very much for the committee's time today and for all your comments, questions and suggestions. And if there is anything else that you feel I could provide to you, please do not hesitate to write to me at all.
Thank you. Okay. Peter, is there anything we need to...
Chair, we'll look at some of the issues that have been raised, and we can transfer that then into the memo we produce for if and when the bill reaches the committee around the issues that have been raised. We'll also be bringing a survey to committee next week for members' approval, so that we can put that out immediately when and if the bill comes to committee. Just obviously flagging up to members that time is not on our side, and the likelihood is that this bill will also we'll probably look to take a motion to extend this to the end of January. The bills we know are coming subsequently, potentially 2 to 3. We may look again at when we do an extension of committee stage, but for this one I think we're probably going to have to look at the end of January again, same as for the small scale green energy bill. That limits the amount of time we have in terms of bringing in witnesses and other issues, so we'd be kind of trying to focus, I think, on scrutiny of the bill itself in the time that there is, rather than what we might have wanted to do if we'd had more time, where we would have looked at essentially, unpacking the bill, looking at every issue, taking that as far as we possibly could. The focus will be on the committee deciding whether it wants to get this bill through largely as is, but with potential revisions or additions here and there to make it more user-friendly, if I can put it that way.
Yeah. Okay. Members happy enough?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to move on. I'm just conscious that we're at 11:20, so we might want to be concise in our questioning in relation to the next briefing, and try and get through both equally. Item number 5 then is the small scale green energy bill briefing from Renewable NI. I think we have both our witnesses. So there's a clerk's memo at page 35 of our packs, and then Renewable NI's response to the bill is at page 38 of the pack. And just I'd like to welcome to the meeting Stephen Agnew, who is head of Renewable NI, and Stuart Hobbs, who is Director of Energy Services at SSE Electricity. So I'm going to hand over to yourselves to make an opening statement, and then we can open it up to members for questions.
Thank you, Chair. I'll maybe kick off and then bring in Stuart. So Renewable NI is the trade association for the renewable electricity industry in Northern Ireland. We represent over 40 member companies who are engaged in wind, solar, storage at different levels, and indeed across the supply chain as well. Renewable MI welcomes the focus that this bill has brought to micro-renewable generation. We see micro-renewables as a key part in ensuring that the transition to net zero is a just transition. And we do believe that support through the wider energy strategy for micro-renewables is something that should be brought forward through, for example, grant support, but also amendments to building regulations to require renewables in new homes and indeed energy efficiency in existing, for example, rented properties. So we see this as the best way of stimulating the market for micro renewables as part of a wider energy strategy rather than sort of taking it as in and of itself. So that's our broad position on this, but obviously happy to take individual questions from members on it. But in the first instance, I'll pass over Stuart just to introduce himself and SSE, who are members of Renewable NI.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. And thank you, Stephen and Renewable NI, for the invite along today, and obviously the opportunity to speak to the committee today on this as well. Similar to Stephen, we obviously have a kind of a vested interest in the promotion of the adoption of microgeneration on a kind of a more broad scale across the industry in Northern Ireland. We are one of Northern Ireland's largest green energy suppliers in the market as a whole, with over 300,000 homes and customers. We're very much supportive of helping consumers and homeowners in the transition to a net zero transition over the next 10 years and beyond. And I think that's clearly seen in the heritage within SSE and obviously the ambitions. We recently announced to markets as part of our kind of half-year results announcements an acceleration of a 12.5 billion investment in renewables across the market. And I suppose in the context of my own portfolio within energy services operating in both Northern Ireland and South of Ireland, we're clearly setting ourselves and structuring ourselves to support customers to decarbonise their homes, make their homes more energy efficient. And next year alone, in the context of Southern Ireland, we're proposing that we would be installing over 2,000 solar PV systems for domestic homeowners, customers and commercial customers as well. So aligning to what Stephen has already said this morning, we're clearly supportive of microgen in terms of the principle and the adoption of it. In the context of this bill specifically, whilst the intent we think is obviously really well placed in terms of trying to accelerate the promotion of microgen, we think there's probably a broader perspective to be considered, looking at the whole kind of end-to-end life cycle of kind of the adoption of microgen, from grants through to kind of say low-cost financing models to support customers in doing that, looking more holistically at the bill in the context of a broader energy strategy and what might be done in that regard. So again, I think whilst we welcome the kind of the bill and the intent of the bill, we're certainly looking at that there might be a broader consideration of that. So again, welcoming any questions today from the committee.
Okay, thank you both for your initial comments there. Obviously, the committee has been very focused on the energy strategy, and we have just this morning agreed to write back to the department asking for the timescale and the publication, because we had been expecting it before now. And we have been pushing for that. So obviously that's the context in which we're looking at this. We do also know that the department doesn't intend to bring forward any legislation in respect of the energy strategy in this mandate. And so there is an opportunity with the PMB, I suppose, to get some sort of legislation in respect of small scale renewables onto the statute books, hopefully in advance of the at the end of the mandate if it progresses. But we obviously have heard from different stakeholders the view about how it fits into the energy strategy. So maybe we just ask for your views around how you potentially see it being rolled into the energy strategy, or are there any particular changes that you would like to see to the bill that you think could facilitate that? And obviously it is a framework bill. Any kind of schemes that would be developed would be for the department once the bill would be passed to incentivise the uptake of renewables and to ensure that those objectives, particularly in respect of a just transition and supporting those who are least able to afford it, are met. So maybe just if I could ask your views around those things.
Yeah, I'll maybe kick off, and Stuart, if you want to come in with anything further. I mean, in terms of, you mentioned just transition, and one of our concerns is, by setting a minimum price. So, as I know you heard from Power NI, and they already set a regulated tariff for export. To set a minimum tariff potentially could put up the costs for the general consumer and benefit those who've already invested in micro renewables. So it won't. It may, but it won't necessarily generate new investments, but it will benefit those who've already been able to make that investment, and indeed who are already being supported through ROCs payments. So we are concerned that what this does is actually, I suppose, benefit an already, to some extent, privileged consumer at a cost to the general consumer, including those in fuel poverty. I suppose another concern we would have in terms of the 5% minimum generation is I suppose we don't really fully understand what our current baseline is. So I know I saw the briefing from Aidan Stennett, and there's this issue that we don't know how much of sort of non-export is micro generation. And this ties into the issue of the lack of smart metering in Northern Ireland. So there's a lot of missing data around this, or not so much missing, but just a lack of data, I suppose, that again, we think we would need before bringing forward proposals like this, effective proposals. We need that data, as I say, to inform that decision making, and we just don't think it's available at present.
Yeah, and again, probably similar to what Stephen has expressed. I think we think it needs to be kind of part of kind of a broader perspective. I do think we think, as part of the microgeneration and any kind of tariff, whilst we kind of certainly recognise there needs to be kind of fair remuneration of consumers for any export that might be available to them, or the part of kind of their install. We think that we're probably going to end up remunerating just the people who already have those systems. As part of kind of a more holistic view, we think we need to kind of consider how we're going to support customers getting over that initial investment hurdle, through kind of, say, maybe exchequer funded grant programs, and supported by utilities and remuneration through export as well. We also consider that, certainly in terms of what we see more broadly across Europe, and certainly in terms of, say, a key principle that we see as being important is to, as we design systems and install systems for microgeneration in homes, that the first principle and a key principle needs to be kind of self-consumption. That kind of promoting and actively promoting kind of, say, export by setting minimum prices is maybe kind of going to drive the wrong behaviours in terms of oversizing of systems, putting, say, unnecessary pressures, and also avoiding consumers taking on things like, for example, using what they need on site, kind of investing in kind of, say, on-site storage, whether it be batteries and stuff, and taking some of the pressures off that. So from our perspective, whilst we do view remuneration and export remuneration for consumers as being kind of key, we think it's part of a broader, kind of more holistic view that needs to be considered. And we do want to kind of see consumers, as they start to install systems, thinking about self-consumption as in the first principle. That's obviously, and that certainly will help kind of manage and drive down kind of cost of energy in their homes, and obviously make them more self-sufficient in that regard as well.
No, thanks for that. Those are really useful points in respect of both the potentially benefiting those who've already invested in, and obviously John himself is who's the bill sponsor is looking to come in, but obviously would see that this bill would be supported potentially by other incentive schemes that would be developed out of the energy strategy to get the people over that initial hurdle of being able to invest in the technology. Also, the point around the promoting self-consumption, I think, is an important one. And I guess some of the discussion we've already had about the bill is the opportunity, for example, people in rural communities or cooperatives to, I guess, come together and invest in the technologies and then use it for their own purposes, but also potentially have the opportunity then to export any additional capacity. So I guess it's really useful to get those views, and I'm sure John will take them on board, as will the committee, in terms of our consideration. But John is the next person who's looking to come in, so if he wants to pick up on any of those points.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you to Stuart and Stephen for both their written presentation and also their commentary thus far. As Stephen will know only too well, private members' bills take quite a long time even to get to this stage, and this one has been in development for over a year. So I would have hoped by this stage we would have had the energy strategy, so I could have matched this bill against the energy strategy and see how it fitted in or didn't fit in, in that context. So it is unfortunate, as the Chair has said, that we don't have the energy strategy, and we don't appear to be going to have the energy strategy anytime soon, but I hope I'm proved wrong on that point. Just in terms of what stage we're at, my bill doesn't dictate the definitive terms of the scheme. It does set out a number of parameters for a future scheme in terms of targets, date, and what major companies, though I have to define what a major company is in detail. But I do think, sometimes that we get a step ahead of ourselves of what will be in the scheme, or this bill will decide what the scheme is. That's not where we're at. So even in terms of will consumers receive double payment in terms of ROCs payments, it's not the intention of my bill that they will. It's not the intention of my bill that the vulnerable in society will pay for the funding of any scheme in the future. No, I accept that may be the outcome of a scheme, but it certainly wouldn't be a scheme I'd be supporting. So to get into my questions, just in terms of current microgeneration in your sector, in terms of what percentage of microgeneration are you taking as part of your contribution to the grid and your sales to consumers?
Go ahead, Stuart. I think that's one for you.
So in a Northern Ireland context, we're not really in the market in terms of the context of, say, microgeneration, neither in terms of offering an export tariff, nor in terms of providing, say, an install kind of program in Northern Ireland. I can give you certainly some context as where we are in an ROI context, and certainly we think, and certainly we're seeing acceleration come into the future when we have this. And I know it seems like we're going to make a lot of excuses today in relation to the energy strategy coming and what that might do to help define what the kind of the next 10 years looks like from a Northern Ireland kind of landscape. But I think it's true. So I can only reflect on where we are in other kind of jurisdictions that I operate in, and certainly in ROI. But from an ROI perspective, we see a massive acceleration of solar PV, in particular. In an ROI context, we will and have an ambition to support and help customers install over 2,000 systems next year. We also welcome the fact that there's a new microgeneration bill coming out down here, which will microgeneration tariff defining that will be coming out now in the next kind of number of months. And we welcome that, because that will certainly give clarity to suppliers and help support us. It's very much being focused in the context of pegged and linked to wholesale prices, but allowing suppliers to kind of operate that on a competitive basis. And certainly we see that as being key to kind of help driving value for consumers, because we see it in the switching market. It's a very active and competitive market, and we think utilities and suppliers will have to respond by offering attractive export rates and tariffs for consumers. So we certainly, from our perspective, that's key to how we will see kind of help supporting customers on a tariff basis. But what we've seen, kind of the real kind of, I suppose, successes in ROI in particular have been through those grant support schemes. And I think through a lot of innovation we've seen in the market more recently in terms of, say, low-cost financing options. And a lot of that being driven by, I suppose, the private sector and kind of, say, and private equity financing that's been delivered. So from our perspective, we see that as being key to success. We don't really have a target on kind of how many microgeneration export tariffs we'll have on board, but certainly we see this becoming much more, I suppose, prevalent in the market as people adopt the technologies. So in answer to your question, John, in terms of, say, the bill in Northern Ireland, we see it slightly as being kind of we have the existing microgenerations that are installed, but slightly putting the cart before the horse, we do need to consider how we're going to more mass markedly promote the adoption of microgen. And certainly one of the key barriers that we see at the moment is that initial investment hurdle. That microgen prices have come down, but we do see still an investment hurdle over in terms of making that initial investment. And without having the systems in place, it becomes a bit of a moot point to have a more progressive microgen obligation tariff.
So, in terms of your view of microgeneration, is it fair to say that you accept that it is achievable, it is doable, but the question that's in your head, and it's a legitimate question, is how it's funded and supported going into the future?
I mean, certainly with the right environmental factors and policy and political factors, we do see the acceleration of it being an achievable ambition. But we see it as being part of a whole picture view, and certainly where we have seen that working and being successful is one, clearly setting a target and ambition. We've seen that in ROI in the context of the climate action bills and the strategies around climate action, which I suppose has created a really strong social narrative. We've seen that backed off and then supported by the right environmental factors for investment, be it through grant schemes or low cost financing models. So again, they're probably some of the factors that don't exist today in Northern Ireland, but that's not to say that they won't exist when we start to see the emergence of what would be a clear and cohesive view on the energy strategy of Northern Ireland, of which I have no doubt microgen and the support of microgen, both in terms of remuneration through a tariff scheme and also in terms of, say, investment supports will be part of that as well. So, I mean, I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest we can't see those numbers coming up, but we don't have a clear view on it yet because of a lack of data, for example, and stuff.
And finally, this issue of self-consumption via export, the scheme you're talking about in the south, is it focused on self-consumption or is it export? And what have you any views on that?
Well, no, the clear articulation both in terms of policy and also in terms of, say, the strategy around microgeneration and also within the microgeneration tariff discussions and regulations that have been defined. It's clearly viewing that we should be promoting self-consumption as a first and key principle, that we shouldn't be oversizing systems for, to focus on export and people to be remunerated. I think also, John, to be clear as well, I think one of the big challenges we'll also face is we need to be clear not to over-egg the pudding in terms of setting expectations for customers of how much they might earn or be remunerated in terms of export. I think that would be, potentially, if we don't get the narrative right and the expectation setting right, that can be a barrier to the adoption of microgen more broadly, which is a key principle for decarbonisation of our housing stock. So again, we have consumers that if we're not setting the expectations right, who are thinking they're going to get hundreds of pounds worth in terms of export remuneration back, and it ends up being a very small percentage of their overall energy bill, that sets I suppose, a poor expectation, which bleeds into the more broader society in terms of, is it worth the investment? So I think we need to be really, really careful in terms of, say, we should always focus on the principle of self-consumption as the first and key principle for consumers, because that will clearly help reduce their energy bills, help decarbonise their homes, and obviously it's the right thing to do. And then if there is some additional spillover, that there is a fair and equitable remuneration of that export, but the first principle should be self-consumption.
Thank you very much. That was very useful. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Matthew?
Thank you. Thanks both for your evidence. But it's just it's not a contradiction, I don't know, but it's a slight, just Stuart, so I can unpack that. In the south, SSE is completely on board with and helping facilitate growth in microgeneration. More work is happening. There's another bill, I think there was a 2017 support scheme bill. Now, you're making the point that you think the emphasis should be on self-supply rather than just simply export to the grid. But at the same time, you're cool on the bill up here. Am I fairly describing your position?
I mean, I think in terms of on this bill specifically, because it's, I suppose, a piece of legislation in isolation and it's focusing on a minimum tariff piece. I mean, that's the main area that we would see as being a challenge and an issue with the bill itself in this particular case. I think so. For example, just to be clear, we're absolutely fine in terms of, say, microgeneration, we're absolutely supportive, and we're happy to help consumers to adopt that, and we do, and through kind of our energy services teams. And as part of kind of say the defining and the development of a kind of microgeneration export tariff for the south of Ireland, again, we're very supportive of that, but we see it very much as being kind of, say, led and supported by a competitive market as opposed to, say, setting minimum tariffs.
Right, okay. So presumably, part of your complaint about, or not complaint, observation about this being in isolation is an energy strategy. Do you, or indeed Stephen, what's the latest you've heard in terms of the energy strategy?
I'll maybe come in there, and look, echo John's comments, that I'm concerned that the energy strategy isn't coming quick enough. When I took up post in 2019, I was originally told we would have an energy strategy. There was no assembly at that time, but it would be ready for the minister coming in by the end of 2020. We're now at the end of 2021. We were hoping, certainly led to believe, that it would come in advance of COP as part of the suite of what the executive's doing on climate change, and we're concerned that it's been further delayed. If it comes in a matter of weeks, then that's reasonable delay. If it's a matter of months, I think that becomes unreasonable. So, what I've been told is that it's weeks, and I hope that is the case. That final redrafting has taken place, and it'll be presented to the executive, as I say, within weeks. But I suppose we'll believe it when we see it, and the investors will believe it when they see it, because it's worth pointing out, in the absence of energy policy, we've had no new large-scale renewables connect in the last 3 years. There are some megawatts due to come online by the end of this year, but it's still not at the kind of capacity we need in terms of acting with urgency on climate change, or indeed achieving the expected 70% renewables target.
But the energy strategy won't necessarily mean it certainly won't mean legislation quickly, for obvious reasons. But we don't even know it'll mean it will guarantee legislation in the next year or two, or even prescribe legislation in the next year or two. Doesn't that mean that like a fundamental function of creating the legal context for shift to renewable is passing a law? Like, what are we not risking making the perfect the enemy of the good by saying, well, this is one bill in terms of that facilitates some additional microgeneration, whether whatever view you have about the communicating the emphasis on export versus self-supply, but are we not risking making the perfect the enemy of the good if we sort of say that all legislation, even relatively discrete legislation, has to wait for a strategy?
I mean, on the wider point about the energy strategy and the legislation, there's a lot that can be done through policy. And for example, one of the things we're pushing for is the extension of the UK CFD scheme to Northern Ireland. That's already been legislated for. I think there was a legislative consent motion passed for that. So that's a matter of policy being taken forward, and I suppose conjunction working between BEIS and Great Britain and the Department for Economy. So, if the department commits to that can be done in the absence of legislation. I take your point. I mean, definitely one of the positives of this bill is it puts a obligation on the department to bring forward a scheme to support microgeneration, in that respect. It is positive, and as I said from the outset, we welcome the focus it's brought in microgeneration. In our response to the energy strategy consultation, we did include the need for support for microgen as one of the things we were asking for. So in that regard, it's positive. We just aren't sure that say the 5% minimum, or indeed as we say, we effectively have an export guarantee, albeit it's market set rather than a set minimum price. So, we think part of the bill isn't needed because it's already there. And as I said before, the 5% minimum is really a difficult one because we don't have the data of what we're currently at. So, can you set a 5% minimum if you don't know what the current microgeneration proportion is? I just think there's other work that needs to be done, and I mentioned, smart meters is part of that role. It's part of something we need, but.
I think the other thing, Stephen, if I can just interject for a second to your point, Matthew, which I think is that in relation to the energy strategy, well, it certainly won't be a panacea for all ills in terms of, say, and we can't obviously hang everything on it. I think certainly what it will do is it'll give clarity and a sense of direction that we're going in. So while we are waiting on kind of, say, specific legislation that might put into place, we will see that in terms of, say, businesses who will be having to operationalise up to kind of, say, the ambitions of the energy strategy will start to, once we see a direction of travel and what legislation will be coming and forthcoming from that energy strategy, I think we'll start to innovate. So I think whilst, it won't certainly, it'll mean that once the legislation starts to flow through from the strategy itself, businesses hopefully will be kind of ready not to be kind of coming from a standing start. That I think that intent, or what's defined from an intention perspective, will help give good signals to the market and to businesses and such like ourselves and others.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I don't have anybody else signalling to come in, so you want to come in? So Keith wants to come in.
I need to start taxing you. I think I'll maybe start doing that. Thanks, Stuart and Stephen. Just a bit of a question. And you referred, Stuart, in your comments about in the Republic of Ireland, but obviously you support it and you have the 2,000 systems coming in place, solar PV, etc. Your definition of export, I presume, is technically that, as in if a domestic dwelling is using, say, 4 or 5 kilowatt hours per day, and they put in, you refer to it as self-consumption, okay, and they use that on themselves, that 4 or 5 kilowatt hours. Do you define that? Obviously is not technically exported, but do you define that as, where do you define that figure? Do you define that as self-consumption, or you define that as a bit of both? Or what way do you define that?
So there will always be kind of an element of residual kind of generated kind of capacity that won't have the ability to be utilised in the home. So again, maybe without any kind of, say, on-site storage, whether it be battery, etc., or with any kind of, say, utilisation of, for example, hot water diverters that kind of utilise the solar PV and put it into your hot water tank to provide the hot water, as well as, say, energy consumption in the home. There will always be an element of export within that, but I think what we'll see is by having, in terms of the key principle of self-consumption, roughly about 70% of what you produce will be able to kind of be used in the home, and then you'll have kind of a certain residual balance left over. But again, it's how we can help consumers innovate around how to best utilise that. And even, for example, things like, having smart meter and smart meter data, having, say, specific time of use tariffs that will blend in, for example, the adoption of things like battery storage, on-site kind of demand control, stuff like that. All those things. Whereas we kind of set minimum export tariffs, people can become overly focused on the export side of it, as opposed to kind of say how they're going to utilise that energy produced in the home. So that's kind of what I was talking about. I don't know if that answers your question, or have I confused the matter further?
No. And Stuart, do you know what that figure is? In those meters, obviously you have import and export. If you're importing, if you're exporting, do you know what that can, what are you getting? That additional 10-20% being exported, do you know what that is in percentage-wise then get into the grid?
So we don't, because again we don't have kind of a full rollout of smart meters here in the south of Ireland. So again, on an interim basis, they were looking at things, for example, like, say, some kind of deemed export value. But again, until we kind of have suppose the more definitive and effective kind of, say, microgeneration view in terms of, say, setting suppliers up to support that, we don't really have that data as such. But again, you could be talking anything from, say, 20-30% of maybe what might be produced on the home.
And how do they get paid for that?
And that will depend on a seasonality factor as well. So there's obviously different seasonality factors to that as well.
And how do they get paid for that, Stuart, if there's no way of metering that?
So at the moment they don't. At the moment they don't. There's no. I mean, that's what the intent of this new microgeneration kind of, say, tariff design that's being brought in through regulation is looking to define. That's been delayed here in the south, but that will at some stage have kind of, say, that, and that would be again some kind of reconciliations done by suppliers at the time to kind of define what that is, and yet to set kind of, I suppose, the market prices for what they will be through kind of, for example, suppliers having to innovate around those export tariffs themselves. So we don't have it. We don't have an export view for domestic customers in the south just yet.
And in Northern Ireland, and maybe Stephen or yourself, Stuart, what's the position there? So if you've got solar panels on your roof and you're using 80%, is that capacity there? And I presume they're getting a fee for exporting currently?
Yeah. So Power NI and other suppliers set a, well, Power NI's tariff is regulated, but it's based, I think Power NI actually made this point themselves. It's based on what the expected market price would be. So, but then on the other hand, on the other side of it, in terms of the householder, in terms of what they export, it's deemed export. So because we don't actually know, because we don't have smart meter and how much exactly is being exported to the grid, a kind of estimation again is made of what you would expect a household to use and what you would expect them to export. So as I say, both in terms of the price that's given and the amount that it's given for, you're working in estimations, but that's all regulated by the utility regulator.
Okay, thanks, Stuart, Stephen. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Keith. Stuart and Stephen, I don't have anybody else indicating to come in.
To come back in.
Oh, John. Oh, yes, no, John. John's
Oh, sorry, John, I didn't see your message. Can we bring John back into the spotlight, please? Thank you.
Just a quick question for information. Stephen, do any of the companies which Action Renewables represent currently purchase electricity from microgeneration?
So you say Action Renewable, we're Renewable NI, but Action Renewables members of ours, yeah. So sorry, repeat the question. Sorry.
Do any of the companies you represent, do any of them purchase electricity from microgeneration?
Well, I suppose Power NI are members of ours by virtue of being part of the Energy group. So they certainly would, yeah.
Oh, right, okay. Okay, that's grand. Thank you.
I think that's the answer you're looking for. I hope so.
Well, no, I was wondering if any of the smaller companies did, but maybe if you have that information at hand later on, or you want to share it with us, or you can share it with us, please do so.
Yeah, happy to.
Yeah.
And Matthew's just looking to come back
I was
in.
actually going to follow up on John's question. Sorry, Stephen, just about, I'm clear, when you say Power NI as part of the Energy group, obviously that means it's part of a bigger all-island group, but Power NI, presumably they purchase as Power NI, or could you be clear that they themselves are purchasers of micro-generated renewable energy?
Yeah, so obviously they provide the tariff, the regulated tariff, so they're essentially acting as a purchaser in that regard. As I say, it'd be more Energy group that would be members of Renewable NI, but Power NI is part of that group. So just making sure I give the fullest answer.
Okay, but yeah, I think I'm not quite sure. But anyway, okay.
Okay, so Power NI are the regulated. They're the only electricity provider that's regulated. So they have the regulated tariff for microgeneration. Is that? I am.
Yeah. So other suppliers can and do provide a tariff. Say Power NI set the regulated tariff, and then I suppose other suppliers can compete. You know, those typically we don't amongst our membership have our focus on supply. We're more on the generation side. As I say, the membership of Power NI is more virtue of them being part of the wider Energy group, which includes renewable generation. So yeah, those other suppliers wouldn't be members of ours. I wouldn't have a lot of information on sort of their tariffs, etc. But you know, happy if it's helpful to try and dig into that information.
Thanks for that, Stephen, and that's useful clarification as well. In respect of Energy being part of the Renewable NI as generators as opposed to Power NI as suppliers, so that's useful. Okay, I don't see any other people indicating. So look, thank you very much for your time and for the briefing. It has been very useful to us as always. And if you do have any further information that you think is of use to the committee in terms of our consideration of the bill, we'd be happy to get that as well. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we'll just move on to the next one, Peter. So item number 6 then is our briefing also on the small scale green energy bill from Dr. Patrick Keatley. And there is a clerk's memo at page 43 of our pack. There's a response from Dr. Patrick Keatley, Ulster University Centre for Sustainable Technologies on the Small Scale Green Energy Bill at page 46 of your pack. And Patrick's already in the spotlight there, so I'm going to hand over to you to make an opening statement, and then we can open it up to members for questions.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Patrick Keatley, Ulster University Centre for Sustainable Technologies. I'm a lecturer in energy policy and infrastructure. My research work recently focuses on the role of consumers, the role of flexible demand, and the empowerment and democratisation of citizens in the energy transition. That's through a number of research projects, including the EU-funded Spire 2 project, and more recently work with the Northern Ireland Housing Executive and looking at the role of the social housing sector in the energy transition. I've said in my response to the committee on the bill that I'm fully support. I'll be very keen to see more incentives for consumers to become active participants in future energy markets. I'm concerned about the way that the bill is currently framed, and when we look back at what happened with ROCs, for instance, and how that bill was, or the levels of uptake, or who actually got involved in installing solar PV, which is overwhelmingly the main technology, that tends to suit, or has tended to suit, specific socioeconomic groups. So people who own roofs and who have access to capital. And there is a risk in general in what's happening with energy systems as they become more intelligent and demand side measures become more available, that there is a risk of some people being left behind in that transition because they, as I say, for instance, because they don't have access to capital or because they're not homeowners. So, sorry, that's the brief introduction.
Thanks very much for that. And this has been part of, I guess, our ongoing conversation and the consideration of this bill, and certainly something that we see it fitting into the kind of broader energy strategy. And one of the objectives of it is around affordability for consumers. And very much would see this bill obviously would set out a framework, and then any schemes would come underneath it. But and I'm aware of some of your work, Patrick, and also the project around the housing executive and the opportunity, I guess, there is for the likes of social housing associations, or different the housing executive itself, or other bodies, for example, that might be able to utilise the I guess the minimum tariff that would be set out under this bill in terms of putting in place whatever technology it might be, and then having the ability to sell what isn't used back to the grid. Is that something that you potentially see as being beneficial, and obviously then having to fit back into the development of any schemes that might be brought forward under the energy strategy?
Yeah, I mean, for the work we're doing at the minute, there is, and it's obviously more relevant than ever given the current crunch in gas prices and energy prices generally, is trying to focus on the most vulnerable households. And there's a number of mechanisms that you can do that with, and a tariff for generation which which focus strongly on that particular socioeconomic group, I would fully support. But there is in more general terms, there is you could argue that at the moment there is plenty of green energy about that we don't make use of, and because of the inflexibility of our power system, and because of the fact that we haven't digitalised or created a smart grid, that we waste an awful lot of clean energy that's currently available. So, for instance, in 2020, 15% of our available wind energy was curtailed or constrained or effectively dumped. So one of the projects that we're trying to develop at the minute is looking at that curtailed, constrained wind and trying to find a way to deliver that for free to vulnerable households. That's a project called Energy Cloud. So that rather than the very limited view that the market takes of the value of wind when there is insufficient demand, that could be used as a tool to address fuel poverty. So there is in general terms, would fully support a bill like this, which incentivizes generation from vulnerable households, but also that needs to be seen in the context of a smarter system and making better use of energy that is currently wasted, and that's more to do with demand and being able to provide demand at the right time.
Okay, no, that's very helpful. And I guess in terms of the consideration of this bill and the broader work that the committee has done around the energy strategy, there's a lot of, I guess, common themes that have come together in terms of the kind of points that you have just made there around the need for smarter work in the broader energy system, and then all of that stuff around the capacity that is there and how it's being used. So that's really helpful to us. Stuart, you're looking to come in?
Yes, Chair. Keatley, thank you very much for your comments. Very interesting comment in terms of your broader research and the work that you're doing around how we deal with the current situation of high prices and those that will be struggling to pay for them. But just in relation to your comment in your response to us about how we include those who are currently left behind in their ability to take advantage of renewable resources, as you say, predominantly the renting of roof. What are the opportunities? I chair the All-Party Committee on Social Enterprise, and that's an opportunity in an area in which those who can't afford it for themselves, or indeed don't have the necessary type of property that's suitable for renewable energy schemes. Opportunities for people to come together, either for a social enterprise to organise that, or indeed like Drumlin, which is a cooperative, which allows for very small shareholders to contribute to a much wider scheme that delivers. What work have you been doing to examine the opportunities that there are for cooperative and collective working, either through social enterprise or cooperatives, for those who could not afford or technically may not be able to access the nature of schemes for their own individual property? And the other question I have is around the area that you've raised about those people who are tenants, either tenants of the housing executive, tenants in social enterprise, other social housing, and indeed the tenants of private landlords who may have to put up with disruption to have various schemes installed. How can we develop towards allowing those tenants to get the benefit of what is on the property?
Thank you, Phil. So, in regard to the first question on community energy and that, how do you enable participation for people who maybe don't have the physical or financial resources to join this? So there's a particular project that we're working on in the west of Northern Ireland, which is called Roulette, which is the rural-led energy transition, and that's focused on two things: areas with high levels of constrained wind, so areas where you've got lots of wind generation that is currently being dumped when there is insufficient demand, and areas of high social deprivation. And that's Again, that's with social housing, that's with the housing executive. And I would draw a parallel between community energy and the social housing sector. Community energy tends to be seen as a geographical arrangement, so there's some part or some area that a local group wants to get together and puts it, like Drummond, for instance. But it could also be a virtual, if you like, community, and the social housing sector I would see as a community. It could be, and that brings you two benefits in terms of policy implementation. Firstly, you're addressing that problem of left behind citizens. That's the two the kind of the least well off in society, or in terms of the reports that we do, the quintiles, that the 5 quintiles for multiple deprivation measures. Those bottom 2 groups are social housing and private rented sector, and you're addressing that problem of those groups being left behind. You've also got the benefit of the fact that the housing executive, because of the way we have it's arranged here, the housing executive is a big organisation. Local councils in Northern Ireland don't have the same powers as local councils, for instance, in GB. We would see a much more active community energy sector. But because of the way that social housing is arranged here, that's not managed by the local councils, managed by the housing executive, and that gives you scale, and scale gives you value for money, and it also means that you can rapidly roll out solutions. So that's the answer to the first part of your question. Sure, I'm sorry, I forgot to write down the second part. You were asking me something else. I forgot what it was now.
It was about how we deal with those circumstances where, I think it's really the same questions. It's where people cannot access the equipment necessary, or they don't have the appropriate property. And I think you probably answered the question when you said that it's a sort of a cloud solution, in that you bring together virtually those people who fall into that group of tenancies, and that as part of your tenancy you then take a benefit of a particular energy tariff which you pay. I think you have answered the question in that respect.
Through some form of aggregation, but I just want to add to that, if I may, that should be part of a package as well. And one of the big issues that we have is energy inefficiency, the inefficiency of our building stock.
Yes.
There are ways for that to create value through, for instance, capacity markets. The minute we pay capacity for generation, so we build more generation rather than trying to reduce demand. But there are already examples of capacity markets which reward demand reduction, and that pays for energy efficiency in housing. So there is a way to do this which takes a more holistic, whole system view, where you have generation and you have smarter demand, and you also have energy efficiency that can be incorporated into a holistic package.
At the end of the day, what we're trying to achieve is energy efficiency and energy saving. And then the energy that we do use has to be smart energy, it has to be green energy, and it has to be delivered at a cost-effective price to the consumer. So I guess going forward, number one with the housing executive isn't necessarily tariffs, although that's important in the current crisis at the moment, but the reality is how we actually get our properties up to standard.
There is a sequence, and when I was listening to Stephen Stewart in the previous session talking about what can be done now in the absence of the strategy being published, energy efficiency is got to be the top of the list in every answer, every solution. And we don't need to wait for the strategy for that that's reality. There is no path to net zero without a massive improvement in the energy efficiency of our buildings. So that would for me, would be priority number one.
But what we do need to deliver that priority is government incentives to deliver that, because currently there aren't any at the moment. And there's no point in having TVA cells on your roof and no insulation underneath it.
Absolutely not.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. Can we bring John into the spotlight?
Thank you, Dr. Keatley, for your presentation and also your written submission to the committee, and indeed taking an interest in the bill. Listening to your opening comments about your concerns about the bill and how, and I think it's maybe more what's not in the bill than what's in the bill, just listening to your contribution. And what I tried to do with the bill was to limit the restrictions I placed on a future minister on what they would have in a scheme and the parameters of that scheme. Firstly, because I've no energy strategy to mop it against. And I think the more restrictions you put into legislation on a future scheme, the more difficult it is to react to the circumstances at the time. But I do think, listening to your presentation, that perhaps we do have to include a clause around how we support or how we truly democratise energy production and ensure that those people who you've referred to have an opportunity to benefit from the scheme, both in terms of participating in it, but certainly not being those who are forced to pay for it going into the future. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, the general thesis of the bill, I fully support, 100% support. But when we look back at what happened with ROCs and microgeneration, we can see, so there was some work done, and I'm kind of plagiarising work that was done by a colleague of mine, Sean McIntyre, who's actually doing a PhD on PV in Northern Ireland and what happened with the ROC scheme. And we can see who actually benefited from that, and it was people in the third and fourth quintiles on that social deprivation index. So the bottom two quintiles didn't really benefit, and then the most well off didn't bother for one reason or another. So it was people in those two groups who benefited most. So that's the concern I have about any future bill, that it takes account of that and actually tries to prioritise those two social groups. Basically, that would be what I was push for.
Look, I certainly wouldn't argue against that, and you've certainly given me food for thought in terms of, and perhaps others in the committee as well, as to how we learn from those lessons and whether we require to put that into legislation at this stage rather than the next stage when the scheme is being developed. But it's certainly something that I'll be giving careful consideration to as we progress this bill. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Dr. Keatley, I don't have anybody else coming in for any more questions, so just to thank you for your time and your contributions, as John has said, and interested in the bill itself, and if there is anything further that you want to share with the committee in terms of our consideration of it, please feel free to do so as well, because it will be helpful to us in terms of taking it forward. So thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to move on then to matters arising. A few things here to cover. So there's a response from the department at page 48 of our pack regarding queries that we put to the department, asking if they're aware if BES is considering applying, for example, a windfall tax or VAT related interventions on energy, and if we would receive a portion of the levy from the carbon offset to help tackle fuel poverty. So the response from the department outlines that those matters don't fall under the department's responsibility. They are not aware of any intention to introduce a windfall tax, but it's a non-devolved matter, so there's no requirement for the devolved administration's view to be sought. And on the particular issue relating to the carbon levy, they have outlined that's an issue for DERA, responsibility for fuel poverty also sitting with DFC, and any decision to deploy resources from one departmental area to another would require a referral to the executive committee, and that the minister would expect to be cited of that. So if members are agreed that we would write to DERA asking specifically about the carbon levy and the emissions trading scheme, and any potential resource that would come from it, and also to DFC in relation to the fuel poverty measures. So are members happy enough with that?
Thank you.
Chair, yeah. Chair, just on that point, I just wonder, in terms of, we were talking about the tax side of it, I wonder it may also be useful to copy in the Finance Committee in relation to that as well, because if there was an issue of a potential national action getting taken, which would then burn consequentials, maybe also something that would be worthwhile inquiring through the Finance Committee, but obviously if we refer something on to them as well, just to copy them in, may be useful.
Yep, no problem. I think we should do that. And obviously the Finance Minister has written to Treasury in respect of a potential for a VAT intervention. So if any response that might come in respect of that, also if we could ask the Finance Committee to pick that one up. So moving on then, 7.2, it's also related to this issue. There's a response from the department at page 3 of our table papers regarding funding for the Energy Payment Support Scheme. The paper sets out that a summary of £41 million of reduced requirements from the department that have been submitted to the Department of Finance to provide funding for an energy payment scheme. Where members may be aware that the Finance Minister asked all departments to look at their budgets for the potential for reduced requirements that could go towards such a scheme, and the department has come up with it. Peter, there's also some useful information set out in that response in relation to the reduced requirements, and it might be useful. I know last week we requested officials to come to us, did we?
We have. We're delaying that slightly because we want to get officials in first on ARIA. But things to highlight to members is it does talk about specifically the 21 million of unallocated ERAP at paragraph 6 and paragraph 7, reduced requirements across business areas of 15.1 million. It's actually quite a useful summary of money that hasn't been spent that can now be reallocated to this. But what does, I suppose, concern me a little bit is that those are chunks of ERAP.
Yes.
And was that really what it was intended for, and what now happens to areas that it was intended for that were bid for?
Yeah, and we did specifically ask for the briefing on ERAP and the funding that was allocated. So
until we get officials, we've asked for that in writing. And it'll allow us to sort of compare it against this, but that would be potentially the issue, that money that's been allocated for ERAP is now going towards this energy scheme, and where does that
come from?
Impact on ERAP in terms of other things now that cannot happen. So, Chair, it might be useful to pin that down specifically.
Yes.
Is what's the outcome for ERAP of being able to move this money across? Maybe that's the best way to summarise it.
Yeah, and also last week we asked about any potential either supports or guidance for businesses in relation to the energy cost crisis. And I know that I've had a number of engagements with business over the past week, and it's one of the biggest issues concerning business at the minute. Is the potential for that obviously to run into next year, and the increasing exposure that business will have over that period of time. So it's one I think the department needs to have a bit of a focus on, if we could pick that up again.
Sure.
Okay, so we're moving on then to 7.3, and there is a letter. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Can I just make a comment on that? Sure. This is great news for relief for those people who are facing pressure with energy bills. £41 million from the Economy Department is great news for that sector. But what it does expose is this: there is no plan for economic recovery in the Department of the Economy. and they were given significant amounts of money to support businesses and workers and families coming out of COVID. And the only substantial plan they've come up with is this: give everybody over 18 £100, and that's it. Now, while I and other families, I'm sure, were delighted to receive their £100, it's not a sustainable economic model moving forward. And the handing over of £41 million now of unspent funds is further evidence that there's no other plan in place to support workers and families in the economy moving forward. And I welcome the fact that we're getting officials in, but I actually think we need the minister in. We need the minister to come in and explain to the committee and to everyone else why he couldn't spend £41 million on economic recovery.
I think that's a very fair point, John, and I think it is very concerning that there is that amount of money. Obviously, we know where 21 million of it potentially was set aside for, if not what else it was supposed to be allocated towards. So I think obviously we've requested officials that would endorse the call for the minister to come in as well. Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with some of that. I think there's a point. I mean, we as a party, not a bigger party, but had called for unspent funds from the High Street Voucher Scheme to be redirected towards helping with the energy cost crisis now for households. Clearly, the upshot is that some people, those who happen to be on prepaid meters and who are able to top their prepaid meters up in a local Asda or wherever, probably are doing that in actual fact, and I suppose that's good. I've also made the point that the economic multiplier effect of what is effectively helicopter money is necessarily reduced when you're giving people the money to spend in November and December for very obvious reasons to do at the time of the year. So, I mean, I suppose the question I would ask in process terms is will the executive have the ability to look at a broader reprioritisation of this money? I mean, if this money went to the department on the basis of economic recovery, and as is, John just said, it doesn't seem like that there is a strategic plan for using this money for economic recovery. Is the executive able, the finance minister, other ministers collectively, to take a decision about this money could be better spent on, for example, making an intervention around energy costs, specifically for households, but I suppose for businesses as well, could be considered, particularly small businesses. I think, given the timing, others have sort of alluded to it, there would be some scepticism as to the efficacy of any scheme that would be brought forward in the remaining for the rest of the financial year to spend by the department to spend the money. Yeah,
and I think there is a relatively short period between now and the end of the financial year, and obviously January monitoring is coming up too. But the department was allocated the money as part of ERAP, so it would be for the department obviously to relinquish that under the monitoring round and this monitoring round that this money seems to be have been relinquished. But certainly I think it's worth asking the question.
We'll go ahead and do that, Chair.
Okay, so moving on then to 7.3, there's a letter from the Speaker at page 8 of table papers regarding a public petition about extending the High Street Voucher Scheme to 16 and 17-year-olds, which was led in the Assembly on the 16th of November by Padraig Delargy MLA. This obviously is an issue that the committee has raised over a period of time with the department and have had considerable consideration of with others as well. So it's for members to note, but obviously the committee would broadly endorse the petition. 7.4 then, there's a memo from the Public Accounts Committee at page 9 of table papers regarding the establishment of the Youth Assembly committees and issues and themes which will form the focus of their work. That's for members to note, but obviously again something that we're very happy to see in terms of the Youth Assembly work.
Chair, there's a certain randomness to this. I also function as clerk to the Youth Assembly. So that's why it's come here. Anything that comes to this committee is obviously put in the pack. So a request went out to other clerks about what engagement they might want to have with the Youth Assembly. Obviously, I didn't send that to myself because I know what this committee is doing that it could do with the Youth Assembly. So that's why it might appear slightly random. But that's why I'm wearing those two hats.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on then, item number 8, the Small Scale Green Energy Bill. There's a written submission from Sony at page 50 of our pack, there's a written submission from RSPB at page 52 and from SSE Electricity at page 67. There is a written submission also from the Electricity Association of Ireland on page 12 of table papers, and a copy of the Citizen Space report at page 15 of table papers, and those are for members to note at this stage, and obviously we'll come back to as part of our consideration of the bill. Then moving on to item number 9, there is an SR 2021/000, the High Street Coronavirus Financial Assistance Scheme Amendment Regulations, Northern Ireland 2021. There's a clerk's memo at page 50 of our pack, and the SR itself is at page 76. The SL1 on the statutory rule is at page 78. The purpose of the amendment is to ensure the post office goods and services listed under merchant category code 9402 that are consistent with the policy intent of the High Street voucher may be purchased using the High Street scheme Spend Local card. This statutory rule is subject to negative resolution procedure and will come into operation as soon as possible. The Examiner of Statutory Rules has not yet reported on this rule, so members will be agreeing to the legislation subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report. So obviously it's a fairly straightforward request that the High Street voucher can be spent in post offices. So are members content with the SR as outlined? And we'll put the question.
Could I just briefly ask, was this just an anomaly that had not occurred to officials before?
The basis on which the card worked was being able to be used in a certain number of merchant codes.
Yeah.
With the best will in the world, while a lot of work had been done around that, this has basically been put forward as an anomaly where there are services that this post office supplies under this merchant code that are in tune with what the intention of the scheme is. And it's really just the fastest way.
Presumably this would
open that up.
The merchant code, so would this mean that if you're a Centra or a Mace and you happen to have a post office in it, some of your retail sales might go through the post office merchant code?
Everything that'll go under the 9402 code, it's not the place, it's the goods. Does that make sense?
Right, yeah, okay.
So
but that could include a pen or an envelope or something, no? Is that, yeah?
Potentially. I'm not 100% sure what falls within that code. We've not had info on that. But it's basically bridging a gap where code hadn't been within the scheme before. It was one of the, I think there's 50 odd codes that weren't, including gambling and being able to use it online and so on.
Pay for your mortgage.
Paying for your mortgage, paying for insurance, etc. that were excluded. This one may just have been overlooked in that initial sort out of codes, so that's why they're wanting to bring it in now. Clearly it has arisen that people want to use it for this and that it fits within the ambit of the scheme, but that they couldn't, and now this is a way to try and fill that gap.
Right. I'm tempted, we could get to, won't take us down the rabbit hole of whether people could use to buy stamps. Some people think stamps are legal tender and therefore, but stamps are not legal tender anyway. So there's a...
out of interest as much as anything else, I will try and pin down just exactly what that code covers, because now I'm quite interested.
I'm going
to you can buy stamps and use stamps to pay for other things.
£100 worth of stamps for Christmas coming up.
True, that is true. Yeah.
Oh,
have you found
postage
it?
stamps.
Postage stamps, they're not legal tender. There's a myth that you can use postage stamps, but they have a value, but they're not legal. So I think it's something to do that a postage stamp has an inherent value.
Yes.
As opposed to this pen, when I buy this pen for £2 and it has or whatever, it has no value after it, just as open. Whereas a stamp retains its value, but it's not legal tender. There's a very
that's probably
strange...
why the code was excluded in the first place.
Probably.
Right.
The stamp is like a first class stamp. If I buy a first class stamp, it still has, as soon as I walk out of the shop, it has the exact same value as it did while it was stock in the shop. You see what I mean?
A voucher for a service.
But it's not, I can't go into another thing and buy a Mars bar.
And utilise it with it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, but it's a, so anyway.
Yeah, stamps have some currency value.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And indeed, they have a residual value as well.
No, but I mean...
buy this year's Christmas stamp and the price of the Christmas stamp could go up next year, but this year's Christmas stamp is
I was more talking about the actual, they have an assigned legal value, but they don't have they can't be used to buy things. I mean, this is total geekery and I'm wasting everyone's time.
Pays for the service.
Yeah,
That's the thing.
I was going to say, in terms of without getting too much down the rabbit hole of geekery, is legal tender not ultimately what someone is actually prepared to accept for that? Is there actually, strictly speaking, you think that
No, it has a legal. It actually, I do know a bit about this. I don't think that's what the word what the legal tender means, Peter, but it means something different to do with what the Bank of England will accept. But anyway, well, they're not. But I know what you mean, yeah.
The chair needs to stop this out.
I'm very interested, obviously, but we are going to put the question if members are happy enough. So that the Committee for the Economy has considered SR 2021/000, the High Street Coronavirus Financial Assistance Scheme Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2021, and has no objection to the rule, subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report.
Agreed.
Agreed, yeah.
Okay, so moving on, there is a departmental written briefing, item number 10 of our agenda on the city and growth deals. It's at page 84 of our packs. It's an update to the committee on the delivery of the city and growth deals and progress to date on the department's projects. Within those deals, there is quite a considerable bit of detail in it, so members might want to consider it, and we can bring it back for further discussion on those particular issues.
Chair, our plan is to get an oral briefing at some point in the future. This is really just to keep members up to date with what's going on, particularly in their own areas, in terms of spend and so on. So we will look to schedule once we kind of see our way through in terms of what we've scheduled, probably now up until Christmas recess. So it'll probably be the new year.
Okay. Okay then, so moving on, item number 11 was supposed to be a written briefing on the outcome of the ESF third call, but it has been delayed and will be rescheduled at a later date.
Hopefully next week.
Okay. But something was supposed to be in last week's pack that we didn't get.
We've taken that one out because we're not going to see it anytime soon.
Okay.
Tourism Recovery Action Plan.
Okay. Item number 12 then is correspondence. 12.1 we're going to deal with separately shortly, so we'll leave that one for now. 12.2 then there's a memo from the ERA Committee at page 104 regarding issues that have been raised about the connectivity of farm holdings that have some form of renewable energy source on the electricity grid. So with the committee's agreement, the clerk will respond to the queries that have been forwarded to the department and NIE.
That's not well written, Chair.
No,
what it should,
not.
what is meant, but I'll go back to the ERA Committee, letting them know
That we have raised
the issues, and then seek the responses from NIE and the department.
Thank you. A statement from ESB at page 105 about 3.27 million that has been awarded to it from the Levelling Up Fund to transform the electric vehicle charging network in the north. And if members are anything like myself, will have had many constituents on about problems with the lack of charging infrastructure, so that's a welcome story. Go ahead, Stuart.
Chair, just very briefly, probably a must-see TV programme was Dispatches this week on Channel 4, which dealt with I think you could use the word scandal, of both EV charging points right across the UK. They didn't cover Northern Ireland, but the situation in the rest of the UK and in some regions of the UK is every bit as worse as here, as bad as here. And they also did a bit of myth busting in relation to vehicles as well. It may not all be all that it's cracked up to be, but certainly if you've got a half an hour over the Christmas break, watch the programme. Very interesting.
Thanks for that, Stuart. 12.4 then, there's correspondence from an individual regarding pricing of surplus energy from their solar panel microgeneration system. That's at page 106 of your packs. So if members are agreed, we'll include the correspondence on the report on the small scale green energy bill. And Peter, could we also inquire from Power NI about the suggestions that are made in the letter?
It's particular fascinating piece of history of creating your own PV panels. There was black radiators painted, put on the roof way back 30 plus years ago, and that's inventiveness. and to be lauded. So absolutely, we'll refer those queries on.
Thank you. Then at page 107 of your packs, there is a copy of CBI's COVID-19 working group notes from the 17th of November. So those are for members to note. There is a copy of an invitation from the Dairy Council at page 108 of our packs for the EU Sustainable Dairy Symposium, which is today at 2 p.m. So that's for members to note, and they can register if they wish to do so at the link there. And then 12.7, there's a copy of the Department for Economy's economic update for November at page 110, again for members to note. Then 12.8, a memo from the ERA Committee at page 29 of table papers that the Minister for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs will be hosting a webinar to discuss the consultation on the Green Growth Strategy, and that's on Monday coming at 3:45 p.m, so you can reply directly if you want to attend that. And then 12.9, there's a response to correspondence from the DALO to the Committee of Finance at page 30 of table papers, with an update on the levels of DFE COVID support scheme overpayments and writing off payments made in error under the small business support scheme. So that's for members to note. Then 12.10, there is a note from DFE at page 33 of table papers regarding the delay in laying the accounts for the department for 2020-21. They are expected to be able to lay the accounts before the Assembly, before Christmas recess, and obviously committee will be notified once they're able to do so. So again, that's for members to note. Then 12.11, there's a letter from Lord J to Paul Scully MP at page 34 of table papers about amendments and corrections of the CREU 2021-850. So that's for members to note. 12.12 then, there's a copy of the Fiscal Council's report which was published yesterday, the Public Finances in Northern Ireland, a comprehensive guide at page 35 of table papers. That's for members to note. There's also a copy of the Fiscal Council's response to the 2021 spending review, also published yesterday at page 45 of table papers. So again, for members to note. And so we're going to move on then to item number 15, which is the Advanced Research and Invention Agency Bill. There is a clerk's memo at page 56 of table papers. There's a letter from the Minister at page 60 of table papers regarding the ARIA Bill. A copy of correspondence from the BES Minister at page 63 of table papers to the Chair of the House of Lords Protocol Subcommittee, which we had last week in our packs, and a copy of the ARIA Bill itself at page 65 of table papers, a copy of the explanatory memorandum at page 85 of table papers. The committee has received correspondence from the Minister regarding the ARIA Bill, which is currently proceeding through the House of Lords and associated LCM. The bill seeks to establish the ARIA, which is the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, which would be a British government funding body for Britain and the North for high-risk, long-term R&D, delivering on the British government's commitment to invest at least £800 million in high-risk R&D over the 5 years of the current Parliament's term. The Minister has indicated that given the negotiations between BES and the three devolved governments regarding ARIA, they have only recently completed, there is insufficient time to allow for the usual LCM process and still meet the 6th of December deadline for getting cross-government agreement. Officials will provide an oral briefing on ARIA at the next meeting to outline the proposed LCM and the MOU that will be put in place between BES and the devolved administrations in more detail, and to clarify what has been resolved through negotiations with BES. And if members read the Minister's letter, they will see that this is not the initial kind of way that was outlined for putting in place ARIA initially. So it has developed through negotiations and objections from also the Welsh and Scottish administrations. So in the meantime, if members are content, just given the tight time frame, that we would write to our key stakeholders, providing them with a copy of the bill and seeking their views on its proposed extension through an LCM. and also just to advise members that key stakeholders will include the further and higher education sectors as well as business sectors. So are members content with that as an approach?
Thank you.
Okay. Then item number 13 is any other business. Stuart, did you want to go back to the comments you were making earlier in relation to the Hatch report, or are you happy enough?
Well, no, I think in fairness, Chair, we have dealt with it. The issue is on the issue is on our agenda now to keep a tight eye on, and as the clerk indicated, we will be writing to the Minister to seek a copy of the report. Not really interested in how it's been leaked. More the issue for us is that report, and to make it very clear, I will be very party political in this respect. This report should be the death knell of petroleum exploration in Northern Ireland.
Okay, no other AOB has been indicated, unless members have anything they want to bring up now.
Nope.
So then item number 14 is the date, time and place of our next meeting, which is next Wednesday morning, 1st of December, in this room at 10 a.m.
1st of December.
I know.
Thank you.
Committee room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee